years ago, I went off to India because I became mesmerized by the fact that there were never more than 3,000 officers ever stationed in India. And what we're talking about is 3,000 white dudes were able to dominate 350 million people on an entire subcontinent for a century and a half. How? I just wanted to figure it out. I just wanted to break from DC, so I figured I would go, and I was pretty much looking for some kind of Da Vinci Code, you know, because I couldn't figure out. My father was in the service, but I understand command structure, but still. And I was embarrassed, and I'm still embarrassed to acknowledge that within 12 hours of arriving in Delhi, I had figured it out. I was walking through Nehru's home, and it became very obvious very quick that as long as the British could keep the Indians divided by race, caste, geography, language, and fighting each other, it was a piece of cake. A piece of cake. And I laughed out loud at Nehru's home because in 2004 I realized that's the nonprofit sector in America. That's our problem. You know, I just written a book and it's on sale tomorrow, and I'm almost embarrassed because I would spend all that time blaming the players when it really was the game. So I came back to Washington, D.C. determined to do something about it. Now again, no one's appointed me, I haven't been elected to anything, and no one would be smart enough to put me in charge of anything. But the point is, as just a direct service provider, somebody who on a daily basis walks into the biggest shelter in America and has to feed 5,000 people leftover food from a restaurant, I refuse to accept that as the only solution. We must go to a very different place, and we must be the ones to take us there. Who else in America, you know, has this charge? It is us. It is our task to do this. But I would suggest that the tactics we have employed to date, while historic, while time-honored, while oftentimes still we pledge our fealty to it, they haven't worked. And they're not bad, and the people who do them are not bad people. They're not bad leaders. The problem is it just isn't going to work. But more importantly, and germane to today, is that you could see coming legislation was going to be forwarded by uninformed people basing their ideas on an anecdotal understanding of what we do that would hurt us hard, and we didn't have a say in the process. That's kind of what we came together. Now, this is where my tactics took a little bit of a different turn, because I wanted to go immediately into presidential politics. This was going to be the first election in almost 80 years with no incumbent president or vice president in the race. And the notion that 10.6 million people who work in a nonprofit organization couldn't stay together at this strategic moment and ask one of the two candidates, as we should today and in every election, we are 10% of the economy, we are 10% of the workforce, we are the third biggest employer in America. What is your plan, and how does it include us? It's a very simple, all boats must rise tactic. And it's something that everyone should be able to embrace, because again, this is one of those strategic moments where we must put aside our individual issue, as important as housing, arts, aging, hunger are, and the countless others. As important those things are, they are not nearly as important as electing people who have a clear and defined understanding of our role in the economy and our day-to-day work. Until we do that, all we're going to be doing, and I got to tell you, I am tired of trying to educate politicians. I'm tired of it. It's a dumb tactic, with all due respect. You know, what we must fundamentally do is go out and elect an entire new generation of people who come to work on day one, fully aware of what we do. I don't want it to go in and explain the economic benefit of caring for our elders, or making sure kids finish school, or making sure people have a good meal to eat. But I think what I want to do is set on a course now that we fundamentally go out purposely, as individuals, as tax-paying citizens, and help elect peers who will represent our issues, but also our ideas and our contributions at the State House. I'm not looking for a special interest group. I'm not looking for somebody who will protect our piece of the pie. The reality is, when you go to England, it's only one of two countries in the world where there's a minister of the third sector, the other being Estonia. And people usually laugh when I say Estonia, but the reality is their independence in 1991 from the Soviet Union was called the Singing Revolution, because the Soviet Union would never allow groups to associate. But because the Estonians had such a long history of singing groups, they allowed singing associations, and that's how the Estonians beat the Russians. The Singing Revolution. But every single year, their president comes out and acknowledges the role that nonprofits, NGOs played in their independence. When they developed their constitution, there's a 14-point plan defining the relationship between nonprofits and the government, and nonprofits' job is to maintain civic courage. Man, now that's cool. them. They're trying to cage me, fence me in. So I can work with it. I like to challenge myself. In fact, I always love a good challenge. So I'm going to try and do a few different things this morning, because I know many of you all in the room have heard me speak before. I've had a long run of working with great nonprofit organizations in Chicago and all over the state. So it's, again, a pleasure to be back, pleasure to see so many old friends. And if I just a show of hands, I mean, just so you know, A, I'm a bunch of things. First thing I always say, my name is Robert and I'm a recovering hypocrite. And we can get to that a little bit later. But how many of you all in the room do direct service? Well, nice to see you. Because one of the things that I always try and really acknowledge, and to a certain extent represent, are people who work every single day out in the community trying to make it a better place to live. I do a lot of big thinking and a lot of big talking. But at the end of the day, nothing makes me happier or prouder than to walk back into the DC Central Kitchen, where I see men and women I've had the honor of working beside for many, many years. We just started our 90th class of men and women going through our job training program. We're doing wildly innovative things. But I'm here to talk to you more about the future of our country. And I urge us to, that's what we should be considering as we go forward, because I believe that our work, we produce the best profit in America. You know, the word nonprofit has led too many people to believe, particularly those in elected office, to believe that we don't create anything of value. And you hear this constantly. You know, that nonprofits don't create jobs. Nonprofits don't create money. Business does that. Again, what you're seeing is this false notion that business drives the economy, while charity does good deeds. I would urge you that the revolution I'm talking about is economic. You know, the realization that we are in effect the yin to business's yang. I've said this every day, and I urge you, if we can take one thing away from our conversation this morning, you know, that is this statement: there is no profit without nonprofits. And I want to repeat that. There is no profit in America without nonprofits in America. And I want you to really let that sink in, because it is true. You know, you try and go to a town that doesn't have arts and culture. You try to go to a town without good quality health care. You try and go to a town without education. Try and go to a town without a clean, beautiful environment. Walking trails, clean air, good water. Try to go to a town without communities of faith. It's called Death Valley. There's nothing there. But this is why this gathering and the Donors Forum is so powerful and so important. Because, you know, I would say I wrote an op-ed recently where I actually baited my colleagues, because the title of it was, the most important word for nonprofits is merger. And I said that because I knew, and the immediate response I got in letters were, you could tell people who didn't read it, because they immediately went to merger, bad word, we don't want to merge, two become one. But what I was talking about were a very different level of merger. The first, backroom services. You know, why don't 15 groups get together and hire one HR department, one accounting department, you know, one lobbyist? You know, that's smart business. The second level of merger is state associations, and I urge everyone here to join the Donors Forum if you have not already. You know, because what you need is those essential moments where you put aside your differences and you stand together. If all the nonprofits in the room today, if you all together got together and said collectively, how much money do we bank every year? You know, I was just speaking with the community action groups in Georgia, and what's interesting is they had 20 separate community action groups in Georgia, and we sat around a table, two of these together, and asked them individually, what's your budget, what's your budget, what's your budget? $500 million collectively. $500 million. Imagine if they pooled their banking business and said to banks, who wants $500 million a year in annual business? You do? Great. We want access to capital. We want a seat on the board of directors. Imagine if the nonprofits of Illinois got together and pooled their banking business. Do you know how quickly you could get beyond the grant cycle? Imagine the potential of us loaning each other money to build workforce housing, to launch new businesses. You know, we can do that, but that's just thinking collectively about what are our assets and how do we use them differently. You know, this idea of merging and creating a seal that would drive the daily consumption of the men and women who volunteer to, again, reward businesses. But the final level of merger, and what I urge you to consider most today, is the power of your votes. You know, there are 10 million men and women who work in nonprofits in America. And there are almost 500,000 men and women who work in this state who work at a nonprofit organization. Now, all it takes, just go back to the presidential election with Al Gore and George Bush. The margin of victory was so small. And we're talking about 10 million votes. You know, when you look at the mayor's races and the governor's races. And by the way, there's a governor's race in 2014 in this state. And there will be mayor's races, and there will be city council races, and there will be state legislature races. The essential, not just for us, but for America, is that we start to elect a generation of people who look at nonprofits not as nice, not as noble, but as essential partners in the economic rebuild of the city, the state, and this country. You know, and what many of us want, and I know was advocated today, is the idea of a caucus. What we need is some group, whether it's a caucus. I'm a big proponent of the idea of a liaison. You know, that if we elected a mayor who said, yes, I love the nonprofit sector, I so get what you do, and not only you, but I also understand that all of our universities in this town are full of a generation raised doing service. My God, the biggest, most diverse, most technologically advanced generation in the history of the world, right here in this town. I want them to stay in this town. I want them to launch businesses in this town. And what I love is these young people, they like social enterprises, and hallelujah, those businesses reinvest their money over and over and over. I love nonprofits. More to the point, all the old people in this town who go to the nonprofits to volunteer. Wow, if I could really channel the energy and the amazing life experience of all of these older people in our town, and I could put them together with young people through this amazing, amazing magnifying glasses in the nonprofit sector, hallelujah, imagine what our town could be like. We need to elect people just like that. But more importantly, we need to realize that when they get elected, they're going to be pulled in a lot of different directions. So with the idea of them appointing a dedicated person on their administration at the cabinet level, their only job was to get great partnerships going. And what I would tell you to consider is the governor's race next year in 2014. Imagine if all the nonprofits in this state, starting now, said in 2014 we're going to elect a governor, which one's going to talk about the role of nonprofits? You know, which candidate for governor wants 500,000 votes? You know, all it is an open question. You know, but that idea of starting to say hashtag, you know, ILGov14. The future, it demands a very different approach to our economy. And again, the notion that we do not value the role that arts and faith and health and education collectively play in the livelihood of any town is economic suicide. We need to breathe fresh life into the political process. And there's no one better suited than the men and women right here in this room. The glory of this country is every generation, every citizen has the right, and I would dare to say the obligation to go out and make this community and this country stronger, better, more open. You know, and that's what I urge you to consider. Be that third kind of leader who won't just sit back. Go out, and it's scary. I don't know how many of you all know this, but I just announced after 24 years, I'm leaving the DC Central Kitchen. You know, a program I've built, a program I'm identified with. I get prizes. You know, I'm leaving that. Because just as I spent 25 years asking poor people to step out in a new role, it's time I did the same thing myself. You know, and I'm actually going to go moving out to Los Angeles. And I'm going to open a brand new program, the LA Kitchen, which will take this to a whole new level. And that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm just saying I refuse to get comfortable. I refuse to sink into routine. I must be part of the future. I must be part of something new. I urge you to consider joining me and many, many others on that journey. Thank you all very, very much.